Yes, yeah. Marty's indicating to me she does the Collector's Corner, and I'm going to make some announcements at the break about the barbecue, the L'chaim schedule, and also volunteering around the community. And one of the people that we partner with is Collector's Corner, and Marty has some. Is that what you were waving at me at, or is it my hair? My hair's fine. Okay. I did get a little drizzle this morning. So I think I recovered from it. But we've always had such perfect weather the last 3 years, and I got a little drizzle this morning. But looks like it's still going to be a great day. So what you've been waiting for is Stu, and I wanted to introduce Stu. Most of you probably know him, and or have heard him on the radio or TV or books. And he's an award-winning print and broadcast journalist. He came to Madison in 1975 to take a job at the Cap Times. Dave Zweifel, the editor, hired him. And he's worked in various media and government positions, and he spent 27 years as mediator and arbitrator for the Wisconsin Employment Relations Commission. Although technically he retired 4 years ago, he's a very busy man, and I know that for sure because I hear about all the things he's working on. He is currently a board vice president of the Ward Community Radio Station, and he also hosts Access City Hall on the Madison City Channel. And and previously he published a book that I'm reading right now, and that's Madison Illustrated Sesquicentennial History, 1856 to 1931. The book that we're going to hear a lot about today, and that we're going to hear some of the research from, is Madison in the 60s, and that was published in November 2018. I really appreciate, Stu, that Stu has asked me a bunch of questions about the audience and what we want to present, and so this is a specially prepared thing for us, Madison in the 60s, Jews in the News, and I thank you for working on this and thinking about us and you being willing to share and come and do things for us. Stu is at L'chaim and has been speaking all over town, and I enjoy it. And I thank you very much.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Let's check our levels. I think we need the microphones up a little bit higher. Can somebody take care of that? Turn this up a bit. And until that happens, well, it is a great pleasure to be here. It's an honor to participate in the Levy Summer Series. And it's great to be in Nakoma. I've done book talks on this book from Edgerton to Wausau, and it's nice to be in my own neighborhood for a change. I appreciate that. And in terms of the Levies, I'm honored to be both a speaker at the Levy Summer Series and to have spoken at the Wisconsin Book Festival, and which Marv, of course, helps support very generously. And even though Jeff is not in the book, Marv is. When you read the footnotes in the book, you'll see a number of newspaper clippings, citations to Marv Levy from the Daily Cardinal in the 1960s. So they're all over this book. I am overwhelmed by the interest you've all shown, and frankly somewhat intimidated because many of you have lived the stories that I've only studied. So I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions and comments, and most importantly, corrections at the end, so we can get the story completely straight. Can we get this microphone turned up a bit, the lavalier? Can we get this turned up?
Yes, put it closer to your Put it closer to your mouth.
Oh, thank you, Joe. There we go. So just before I talk about Madison in the 60s, just a little bit about my Yiddishkeit and my big news in the 60s. Say what you will about us, Levitan men can grow beards. Shlomo was my grandfather. He came from Lithuania in 1929 to be the Orthodox rabbi in the Quad Cities area. My father was 14 at the time. My father's generation is the last in his paternal line not to have Orthodox rabbis in their line. Although he did attend yeshiva and spent some time as an itinerant traveling teenage rabbi performing holiday services in northern Indiana. So he did have that. I myself was bar mitzvahed at the Temple Israel in Great Neck, a conservative temple with the wonderful Rabbi Mordecai Waxman as our rabbi. And that bar mitzvah was exactly 2 weeks before this beautiful photo, Boxing Day 1966. So in terms of Madison Jews, The areas of Jewish influence and population. Most Jews in Madison in the 60s were either Eastern Europeans whose families had settled in the bush decades earlier or were somehow connected to the university as student, faculty, or administrators. And from both origins, Jews made big news throughout the decade on civil rights and urban renewal and arts and culture and the university. Not so much sports, but pretty much everything else we were important. And there were only 2,000 permanent Jewish residents in a city that averaged about 150,000 people and about 2,000 Jewish students on campus with a campus population that ranged from 20 to 34,000. There are 48 Jewish names in the index to my book alone, so that tells me that we really punched above our weight in terms of influence versus population. Now, most of the news that Jews made in the 60s was connected to the New Left and the anti-war protest movement. That is not part of today's talk, except incidentally. I could do a whole program about Bob Cohen and Evan Stark and Paul Soglin and Jim Rowan, but I think most of you have heard most of those stories. So I'm going to decided to focus elsewhere. Starting on my 8th birthday, as a creche is installed on the Capitol grounds. This is the State Journal reports, quote, a reminder to shoppers and business people of the real reason for the observance of Christmas. Every weeknight throughout the holiday season, on the Capitol grounds, churches come and sing carols from 7:30 to 8. And, quote, the placing of the image of the Christ child in the crib will be the highlight of the ceremony on December 13th. Again, a creche and a baby Jesus on your Capitol grounds. Change was coming, if a little bit slowly. 4 winters later, the State Journal reports that Madison's growing cultural and religious diversity has caused several schools to reduce or even cancel the annual Christmas program. Requiring students to sing praises to Jesus was not quite right, one elementary school principal remarks, so she cancels the program entirely. I felt this for many years, Dorothy McClellan says, but could not screw up enough courage to do so until this year. The school staff and PTA support her decision to cancel the Christmas program. Other schools seek a balance between secular and sacred songs. Once in a while, some people of the Jewish faith have a reaction to the Christmas program, the principal at Orchard Ridge says, but most go along with it because they don't want to be different. Some people thought we were. Selig Iwanter was a butcher from Vilna, Lithuania, lost his father, brother, and cousins in the Holocaust, emigrated in 1948, first to Milwaukee, then was asked to come to the bush and open up a kosher butcher shop at 810 Mound Street in this building owned by a synagogue. When that was torn down for urban renewal, he moved to 301 South Mill Street, where on October 31st, 1961, someone, probably teenagers, spray painted a swastika and the word Jew on the side of his shop. Urban renewal and assimilation and suburbanization ultimately cost Selig his customer base, and he shuttered the shop in 1969. That was Madison's last standalone kosher butcher shop. Now, although 301 South Mills is technically within the borders of the Greenbush addition, I was talking to Selig's son Sidney, and he says that in the old Greenbush area around Mound Street, there was never any anti-Semitic vandalism. The shuls were never vandalized, and Selig's store was never vandalized. There were students on campus who didn't mind saying they thought we were different. In March 1961, the Daily Cardinal, I think this might have been before Marv was there, but in March 1961, the Daily Cardinal publishes a front-page story exploring the attitudes of in-state students towards non-resident students. The reason why many New Yorkers, who seem to be mostly Jewish and Negroes, come here is that the school has a liberal attitude, says a Racine senior, citing the Socialist Club as an example, quote, of the fact they get away with things they couldn't get away with anywhere else. A Madison sophomore agreed. A large proportion of the New Yorkers are from one religious background and stick to themselves. The fact that they are from New York makes them feel that they are too good. A few months later, one of those pushy leftist New York Jews is among the 4 freedom riders from the university arrested trying to integrate the lunch counter at the Greyhound terminal in Jackson, Mississippi. Paul Brynus is about to start a 2-year term as the Socialist Club president, serves 3 weeks of a 4-month sentence at Parchman Farm, and later recounts that experience to a packed Trip Commons audience and to his housemate and fellow New York Jew and an exceptional 18-year-old guitarist named Danny Kalb. Now, earlier that year, Danny Kalb had hung out for a week or 2 with a young folk singer, someone who was about to take Kalb's journey in reverse, to go from the Midwest to New York. And a couple of nights, they go down to State Street and they play at the pad. Danny's on guitar, the other guy's on harmonica, sitting on the piano. They pass the hat and they make a few coins. And then the kid, who was 19 years old and had celebrated his bar mitzvah in Hibbing, Minnesota, and also attended Camp Herzl in northern Wisconsin, he's off to New York to meet his idol Woody Guthrie and fulfill his destiny as Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan would come back to Madison that spring, spend some time on the Union Terrace, play a bit on a Mifflin Street balcony, and with his original contact here, who was another young Jewish folk singing communist from New York's Lower East Side named Ron Radosh. As president of the Wisconsin Socialist Club, he got the club in trouble by extending an unauthorized invitation to Nikita Khrushchev and Marshall Tito to give a speaking engagement. It was unauthorized, and the club was suspended for making public presentations for 2 months. Radosh calls the discipline fair. You see Marshall Brickman there. Marshall Brickman and Eric Weisberg, 2 more non-resident Jewish leftist folk singing students, had a flat on Clymer Street that was really the underground railroad for young Jewish communist folk singers. And Marshall Brickman, who would later share the Academy Award for the screenplay for Annie Hall, used to write the scripts for the anti-military ball in the early 60s and wrote all these leftist, anti-imperialist, pro-Castro scripts before he went off to his fame and fortune. Eric Weisberg recorded the Dueling Banjos theme and played on the original recording of Bob Dylan's Blood on the Tracks. Another left-wing Jew who came here from New York in 1961, Andrew Goodman, lived at 202 North Park Street, got pneumonia, had to withdraw, and transferred back to Queens College in New York, where he was a friend with Paul Simon, another left-wing Jewish folk singer. You'll sense a trend developing in this section. As a teenager, Andrew Goodman investigated conditions in West Virginia coal mines, lived with farming families in Western Europe, taught camp for inner-city children. A few months before his 21st birthday, he went south to register blacks to vote. On June 21st, 1964, along with Mickey Schwerner and James Chaney, they were all abducted by the Ku Klux Klan, tortured, and murdered. The major civil rights issue as the decade opens on campus is the ongoing effort by faculty and administrators to get fraternities and sororities to comply with the rules against invidious discrimination in their membership and limiting the roles of alumni in choosing membership. And most of the groups on Langdon Street comply with the rules, but some are hampered by the national organizations that really want to hold on to their old way of doing business. Wisconsin's oldest fraternity was Phi Delta Theta. It was founded in 1857 by William Freeman Violets. Frank Lloyd Wright had been a member. And as the decade opens, the men of Alpha House want to comply with the rules. But then the national president explains in the official publication that national policy bars Jews, Negroes, and Orientals, quote, because many chapters do not regard them as acceptable. The faculty immediately bans the chapter from pledging new members, and throws them off campus the following fall unless and until they get the national organization to change its way of doing business. In November 1961, the regents endorsed the faculty action, throwing the oldest fraternity off campus by a vote of 7-1. Alpha House is unable to get the nationals to go along with non-discrimination. They withdraw and create themselves as a local group called the Phi Delts. The largest civil rights action to date was a demonstration by fraternity men and sorority women against university enforcement of the anti-discrimination provisions. They marched in the rain from Langdon Street to Bascom Hall, down State Street and home to protest the university regulation of their membership policies. Now the march is mocked by the editor of the Daily Cardinal, another non-resident Jew, who is a very strong supporter of civil rights. He's a philosophy major from New York named Jeff Greenfield, the first sophomore in the history of the Daily Cardinal to be named editor, the first person to serve 2 years as editor. He resigned as vice president of the liberal Americans for Democratic Action to take this position. He put the civil rights on so firmly on the, he put the Cardinal so firmly on the side of civil rights in the early 60s, he got anonymous death threats. The picture on the left is from 1963 when he was the Madison Award winner at the State Journal, essentially a paid internship for the State Journal. Picture on the right is from the fabulous Madison reunion that Ben and Judy and Geraldine and some others organized last year. And although he would later write speeches for Senator Robert F. Kennedy, Greenfield was on the cutting edge of skepticism about what President Kennedy was doing in Southeast Asia. Editorial from 1962. There are 7,000 American troops there now, and the statement that they are acting as advisors is patently absurd. If we are heading toward another Korea, then it will mean summoning more American youth to engage in combat, or our government denies is taking place. This seems less than an ideal climate for inspiring patriotism. He was not, however, as perceptive about the Beatles, attributing the wild reaction during their arrival at Kennedy Airport earlier that month to press agents manipulating, quote, the hordes of pubescent harpies. Now, between Vietnam and Beatles, I guess it's more important for your editor to be right about Vietnam than the Beatles, and Jeff is very proud of that 1962 editorial, less so about the pubescent harpies. Is the volume okay? Can people in the back, is everybody here okay? Yeah. Okay. Now, while the civil rights issue on campus was largely about housing on Langdon Street, there was a larger civil rights issue playing out about housing throughout the city. As the decade opens, non-whites are losing that fight. There are no laws at any level about housing discrimination. So non-whites here had access to 27% of the rental units and 10% of the housing for sale. Of 19,000 total housing units available in the city of Madison, non-whites had access to 3,500. That's less than 19%. That's why 76% of blacks, as this decade opens, live in just 4 census tracts, and there are 8 aldermanic wards with no non-whites at all. The housing discrimination was so universal, it is reflected on the federal forms. This is a federal urban renewal form. The box says, available for non-white families. That was the world before the various civil rights acts of the early 1960s. And the employment situation for blacks was equally bleak. This is jobs data from 1963, 36,266 white employees, 288 full-time black employees, 90 part-time. So the civil rights movement is a big deal all through the city as the decade opens, and it is a very big deal in December 1963 when Mayor Henry Reynolds, a conservative white businessman, pushes through and casts the tie-breaking vote to create the first fair housing code in the state of Wisconsin, years before the state legislation itself. And the principal drafter of that landmark legislation was a young attorney with the Lafollette, Sinekin, Doyle, Anderson law firm. That is the appropriate reaction. Shirley S. Abrahamson, shown here about the time she made partner and drafted that landmark legislation, and of course more recently. Born and raised in New York City, BA magna cum laude from NYU, law degree with high distinction from Indiana, then a doctor of judicial science here at the UW. That's how she came. She came with her husband, zoology professor, who recently passed away. She's here, she gets hired, Lafollette Sinekin. And this is another indication that Madison in the 60s really was a special place. A person of statewide historic significance. The first female justice, the first female chief justice of the Wisconsin Supreme Court, is a member of the Mayor's Commission on Human Rights and drafts the ordinance creating the Equal Opportunities Ordinance. Oh, by the way, the Irish settlers there, Briscoe and Betsy B. Briscoe is named after Robert Briscoe, the Jewish Lord Mayor of Dublin, who had been a Sinn Féin activist. It's a very interesting story. In drafting the Equal Opportunities Ordinance wasn't Shirley Abrahamson's only important local service. 6 years later, after the Mifflin Street Block Party riots, Shirley's the one who creates the Committee of 30, along with Lowell Fauci and Max Gabler, and goes down into Mifflin to talk to the kids to find out what's going on here. And they tell her stories of mean cops and bad landlords. And Shirley reports back to Bill Dyke, and he believes what she's saying. He orders a comprehensive building inspection of the 4 core blocks of Mifflin, and building inspection writes 221 housing building code violations. So years before Shirley Abrahamson is affecting the legal life in Wisconsin, she's affecting housing conditions on Mifflin Street. And as for the man who hired Shirley Abrahamson, born in the bush to a peddler and his wife, Gordon Sinekin spent his life as one of the most distinguished attorneys and civic leaders in the state of Wisconsin. He also played a vital role in one of the civil rights highlights of the decade, getting Jews into the Madison Club. Now, to put this story into a little more context, a little more about Gordon Sinekin. He was born and grew up on Milton and South Murray Streets, near the intersection which, when he was a teenager in the 1920s, they called Dead Man's Corners because of all the prohibition and vendetta-related violence there. In fact, one night walking home from his violin lesson, he passes the Joseph Aresi residence, where 5 minutes later, Joseph DiMartino is shot to death. As an adult, of course, he lived here in Nakoma. Central High class of 27, UW 31, UW Law 33, Phi Beta Kappa, Order of the Coif, and editor-in-chief of the Law Review. He helped form the Progressive Party of Wisconsin in 1934, was executive secretary to Governor Phil Lafollette, and a member of the firm started by Fighting Bob. Served on General MacArthur's staff, was the first Western officer into Tokyo even before the war ended, and was on the battleship Missouri to see Japan surrender after the war. Was awarded the Bronze Star. A founding partner with Phil Lafollette of the firm that bore their names. Served as president of the Community Welfare Council, member of the Mayor's Commission on Human Rights, community chest, governor of the Wisconsin Bar Association, president of the Dane County Bar Association, a member of the board of the Capital Times, and on and on. Such a good lawyer, the state of Wisconsin named its award for excellence after him. And the man who hired Shirley Abrahamson, surely one of the great Jews of the decade, if not the century. But is that enough to get him into the Madison Club? And what does it matter anyway? Well, here's why it mattered. It's hard to think back to, in this decentralized time, it's hard to think back when a club like the Madison Club was so important. But it was where the legal and the professional elite of Madison entertained and intertwined.
elite lawyers and businessmen just like Gordon Sinekin. Well, not quite just like Gordon Sinekin, because it was one of these places where official city meetings are held. The city government held meetings of its official committees at the Madison Club. So were Gordon Sinekin's accomplishments and life enough to get him into the Madison Club? No. It had long been evident that the club did not have any Jewish members. In fact, the Madison Community Chest, which as you know is the forerunner to United Way, stopped paying dues for its director in 1962 because of its apparent anti-Semitism, and other groups had stayed away. But in October 1964, Collins Ferris, who was the president of the Madison Bank and Trust and a former president of the club, thinks the time is right and he's determined to put the matter of anti-Semitism to rest. So he asks the two most respected and admired Jews in the state of Wisconsin, certainly in Madison, to join. Supreme Court Justice Myron Gordon and Gordon Sinekin. They're reluctant, but Collins Ferris says, no, we got this, do it, it'll be fine. They apply in February 1965. Months go by with no action on their applications. The news isn't public, but it's not completely private either. More months go by, and one member in particular is getting uneasy. University President Fred Harvey Harrington, who joined the club at the suggestion of Arlie Mux Jr., president of the Alumni Association and a member of the club's board of directors. Now, Harrington at the time is state chairman of Brotherhood Week for the National Conference of Christians and Jews, so he is very sensitive to the appearance of anti-Semitism. And he writes Mux urging approval of these two applications, and even suggesting other Jews who would make good members. In September, the 9-member board finally votes on the Sinekin and Gordon applications. 8 votes are needed for approval. They only get 7. The news is not public, but people know. You tried nobly, Arlie, Harrington writes Mux on October 5th. I do thank you for your efforts to open the Madison Club to Jewish members. But club members have failed to measure up to their opportunity and contributed to, quote, this shocking story to our day. Feeling as I do about anti-Semitism and other acts of discrimination, Harrington tells Mux, he's not only quitting the club, but refusing to meet there with other alumni groups or other members in the future. It takes Harrington's resignation a few weeks to become public, and it finally does in a non-bylined front-page article in the Capital Times, and the outrage is immediate and widespread. Collins Ferris expresses disappointment and disillusionment, and others are highly incensed. Several attorneys wonder how quickly they can resign. A petition circulates calling for the two men's admission. It is never officially announced which 2 members voted against Gordon and Sinekin. Directors Dwayne Bowman of Bowman All-Star Dairy and Bruno Stein of Marshall Dairy Labs publicly bemoan the rejection. Construction executive George Ickey snappishly refuses to comment. Mayor Reynolds quickly reschedules the Auditorium Committee meeting, which had been scheduled for that week. Other cancellations follow. The Madison Jewish Council issues a statement. The righteous indignation of so many people over this disgraceful incident is a healthy thing for the community and speaks well of the high moral values of the overwhelming majority of the Madison citizens. Alderman Toby Reynolds introduces a resolution with 14 co-sponsors to take away the liquor license of the Madison Club. The intent is to express the council's disapproval of discrimination and provide a legal basis for further action. And they plan to revoke the license if discrimination is proved. They vote a resolution expressing strong disapproval and direct the Equal Opportunities Commission to start investigating other instances of clubs denying activities or membership for invidious discrimination. Pressure continues to build on the club's directors. Petition with 3 Supreme Court justices circulates. The list of canceled events grows. Now, the directors note that there is no formal ban on Jews in the club. It's just that members don't vote to admit any. But they decide that the current membership plan isn't working. They vote to change the way they amend their membership process to only require 5 votes instead of 7. They ask Gordon and Sinekin to reapply. The 2 men do, and they are voted in and welcomed into the club with varying degrees of sincerity. There were still some restrictions at the club. Women were not allowed to join until 1974. The EOC praises Gordon and Sinekin for their courage and good grace through the controversy, and commends the Madison Club for its positive action in furthering the cause of human rights. The 2 men thank the commission, the EOC. There's no evidence of a reaction from the club. Now again, while the club did not actually ban Jews, there were 3 private clubs of somewhat lesser stature in Madison that did practice invidious discrimination. The Elks, Eagles, and Moose all had provisions in their national charter making them whites-only organizations. Mayor Otto Fesky was a member of 2 clubs that only admitted whites. The EOC starts pushing in 1966 for the city to stop issuing liquor licenses to clubs that practice discrimination. The council finally adopts that policy in 1969, but delays its effective date until 1971. Until 1971, the city of Madison granted liquor licenses to private clubs that did not allow non-whites to join. So back to the bush. Well, this was what the image I was supposed to be showing during that, telling you about the Madison Club in 1965. There are a lot of great images of Madison from the 60s. This is State Street on a late fall day, 1965. So, some more houses and a kosher meat market that young Gordon Sinekin would have walked past as he was growing up. The top numbers are the assessments from 1960. The bottom number is the amount of money the Redevelopment Authority paid when it condemned the property for urban renewal in 1962. So that brings us to urban renewal and the forced transformation of this, the eastern edge of the Greenbush neighborhood, into this, the Triangle Urban Renewal area. Show of hands of how many people trace their lineage in Madison to living on or having family from the bush. Okay, I frankly would have thought it would have been more, but okay. Well, the rest of you are about to learn something. The bush was a 60-year-old neighborhood that was intergenerational, international, interreligious, and interracial, but according to city planners had infrastructure that was inadequate. It is to Madison's shame that we knowingly destroyed this important community without a second thought. It is further insulting to see how poorly we planned and executed, and especially how we failed to provide affordable housing, affordable